Hello and welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much. I'm Jesse, and today we are talking about Plato's Republic. I am joined by Ryan Cook. Ryan's a lecturer at the UCLA, does many courses in philosophy. In fact, teaching a course that is dealing substantially with Plato's Republic right now, I think. So that in my opinion makes Ryan an ideal guest to have on the show. Welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much, Ryan.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you.
So
Delighted.
Yeah. So actually today this is the first podcast I'm doing where I'm having an actual grown-up drink. And it's because we're doing our most sophisticated text. So
Awesome.
We're doing, and this will probably make me become less and less sophisticated as the show goes on. Plato's Republic, which, in the interest of full disclosure, I read in full for the first time over the last couple of weeks. But actually, Ryan, I'm curious. We've known each other for 20 years.
Yeah.
I was actually just thinking about this today, that when I met you for the first time, which was, I think, January of 2000, which would mean I've known you for 21 years, I guess, now that I'm thinking about it. I probably would have just read a little bit of the Republic for the first time a few weeks before that in my first year English course at York. But what's your experience with this book?
I think my experience with the book is probably about the same as yours. I think I would have read it probably right before then. Because I did a year of university and then didn't do university for a couple years. And I think in that period, I read the Republic for the first time. It was one of the reasons why I decided to go back and do more philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was a big influence.
Jesse Hutchison was a big influence. I could tell that there was something learned about you.
Not me.
It turned out that you'd read this book. No. The Republic was a big influence, sure. For sure. Plato, definitely. I mean,
yeah,
it's something that gets you going and makes you want to know more, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit then about this text, and you're going to definitely be correcting me, I think, on a lot of stuff in this conversation, or at least I hope that's what you're going to be doing.
Okay.
I mean, I'll do my best. I'm going to do my best to get it down as correctly as possible. But I thought maybe we'd first sort of just discuss what the book is trying to do, which to me seems to be that the book is attempting to demonstrate why, I've been looking for the right word to say it, but why it's advantageous to be a just person. Would you say that's kind of the central thrust of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Why being a just person will make your life go better, reliably, than if you were unjust. So I'm not sure that advantageous is a good way to put it. Absolutely. It's not necessarily going to make you happy, but it's the thing that has the greatest chance of doing that.
So Plato uses Socrates to as his kind of mouthpiece in the story. Actually, one of the questions that I have is, I don't know how much you know about Socrates, but would you say that Socrates would have been okay had he known that Plato was using him in this way? Are these views attributable to Socrates, or are they really just Plato's views and he's using Socrates?
I think that the Republic is an interesting text because people generally agree or believe that Republic 1 seems to have started life as a work of its own, perhaps. And if that's so,
can I interrupt you for just one second? When you say Republic 1, do you mean the first book?
Yes, or the first book of the Republic. So Republic, of course, is in 10 books.
Yeah.
And it's generally thought that Republic Book 1, which is introductory, might have started life as one of the so-called Socratic dialogues, meaning this might have been a dialogue that was first written with a Socrates character who was closer to the historical Socrates.
Right.
Now, of course, we don't know much outside of the Platonic dialogues about the historical Socrates. We do know a few things that are cross-attributed that a few people say. There are things in the Republic, the later books certainly, that are definitely not Platonic, or sorry, that are definitely not Socratic, that appear to be Platonic inventions. The spirit, though, as everything that Plato writes, I think, with the Socrates character, is Socratic in essence, right? There's someone who wants to get knowledge, that thinks that having knowledge is terribly important to happiness, is committed to the idea that justice is beneficial. These are all Socratic theses. The character believes in a lot of things that I think would have gone beyond Socrates' traditional claim to ignorance, right? These forms, for example,
Right.
all of this complicated stuff about what the soul is like. So yeah, yes and no. I think Socrates would have been probably pleased, but if anything, might have said, well, I didn't pronounce on those things. And you're kind of, doing damage to the reputation for ignorance.
Right.
But yeah, so just to specify what I mean by a Socratic dialogue, there are a series of dialogues where Socrates is more of a questioner. And this is a Socrates that we sort of, people have an idea of what the Socratic method is like. In the early Socratic dialogues, so to speak, Socrates doesn't have a lot of positive material to introduce. He mostly just criticizes things that other people have said.
Right. And actually, along those lines, and I didn't actually necessarily prepare to talk about this aspect of it, but one of the things that I do enjoy about the beginning of the Republic is that it starts off where Socrates is out at a festival, religious festival, right? And then he's kind of stopped by a bunch of his acquaintances, friends, and they force him to come to their house. It's all good natured, like it all seems very fun, and but they're like, you got to come over to our place. And Socrates comes, and he immediately seems to like piss everybody off in the dwelling that they're in, because it's like Socrates is the guy who won't let go of anything. Anytime an issue comes up, Socrates is like, well, have you ever thought about this? And I feel like everybody there in the room is like, oh God, here we go. So that retort that people use of, you must be really fun at parties. I feel like that applies well to Socrates.
Yeah, I mean, however, they do know what they're getting into, and they're the ones who start Socrates going, right? Like this isn't a case where you could argue that you were unaware that Socrates was going to do this. Like you just encountered him on the street. Like, no, you've brought him to your house,
right?
Knowing that he's this sort of person, and you're sort of encouraging him. So, I mean, it's true that they don't love him, and certainly you get a character like Thrasymachus that doesn't have much good to say. But then Glaucon and Adeimantus stick around for a lot longer than I think almost anyone would.
That's true.
Yeah.
Glaucon really indulges him. I think
Glaucon. For sure.
Sticks it through. He sticks it through for quite a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
and as I think I said to you in a personal correspondence over this, as I was reading it over the weeks, is very easily convinced by Socrates.
Yeah, he doesn't have what we would necessarily want in a Socratic interlocutor, meaning someone who's going to challenge Socrates. He lets Socrates develop quite a bit of material without necessarily saying anything except I agree.
Right. There is a lot of I agrees in that. That's true. Yeah. So now, just to go back to the kind of central argument of the work, that it's to show how it's advantageous to be just, why being just will lead to an ultimately better life. I feel like, well, what do you think? I feel like on the face of it, before we get into what the objections are, and I think there is a really kind of convincing, not totally convincing, but there's a good objection, I think, to Socrates' argument right from the get-go. But if you said that to a person today, just it's advantageous to be a just person. Being a just person will lead you to having a better life. Do you think most people would agree with that, or do you think a lot of people would object to that?
I think that most people would want to believe it. I think that a lot of people certainly, ideally, especially if they're people who are moral, and have maybe made sacrifices in their life, and not just for the sake of morality, giving back a wallet or something, but also people who maybe have committed themselves to a life that isn't as financially rewarding as they might have, and they've sought after wisdom or something. I mean, that's another big. It's not just in the Republic, of course, that the life of moral justice will make you good. That's part of it, but also a life that has a lot of theoretical understanding will make you happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think those two groups, people who are themselves or think of themselves as just, as rule following, I think they want to believe that they've got some kind of reward from it, right? Like their justice, even if it's made them suffer materially, they haven't had as good of a life as they might have in terms of outward superficial things like money and reputation. I think that many people, I think I certainly am somebody that would like it to be true, and read the Republic in the hopes. And this is the way that Glaucon is presented too, right? Like Glaucon says to Socrates, I'm going to defend injustice in a particular way, and I'm not doing it because I believe this. It's that I am someone who believes in justice, and I'm somebody that really wants to believe in what you're saying, in the spirit of it. And I want you to do this so that I can be convinced that I'm correct, right? Like Socrates hasn't quite given him what he wants. He likes the fact that Socrates believes, or seems to believe, that justice will make you happy and injustice will not.
Right.
But I think it's more a spirit of faith, that he wants Socrates to give him a proof that is more convincing.
Right. So I like that idea a lot. I like that. If you ask somebody today, would you agree with that argument? You would respond by saying, a lot of people would say they want to believe that that's true. That's So let me introduce. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh no. I mean, I think it's a powerful idea, and I think that most of a lot of the moral instruction literature that we have produced, as humanity, is religious, and certainly a big part of that literature is that you'll be a happier person, not just after you die, and not just because you get rewards, but no, there's something about making the right decisions that makes your life better,
right?
And not just in a moral sense, but in general. I think people do want to believe that.
Yeah. So let me then introduce the objection, which I think is maybe the most significant objection. There's a few objections that he gets at the beginning, but I feel like the most significant objection is the one about, what if you have somebody who is all their lives they act in a just way, but they don't have a good reputation for being a just person. On the other hand, you have somebody else who has not acted just all their lives, but has the reputation of being a great person, basically, is socially recognized for being great. Wouldn't it be better to have gotten away with doing all the unjust things, but still have the reputation of being a great person, than being the person who lived their whole lives, potentially sacrificing a lot, like you just mentioned, sacrificing wealth, sacrificing, and you still, at the end of the day, don't end up with people looking at you saying, wow, what a great person that is for being just their whole lives. And the example that we talked about the other night that I thought might be a useful way of thinking about it is, like, if you think of like somebody like Harvey Weinstein, if I may introduce a controversial figure into this conversation, it's this may be the first time Plato and Harvey Weinstein have entered into the same conversation, but Harvey Weinstein is, but let's say before he was caught out for doing the terrible things that he did, and even let's say, he had a reputation before that. It was like an unspoken, secret throughout Hollywood. Imagine that didn't exist either, but he was still doing all those awful things. But everybody thought he was this great person. He was very financially successful. I feel like a lot of people might say it's better to be him than to have been the person who behaved with, correctly their entire lives, but was not recognized for being that. Would you say that that's true? Would you say that a lot of people would have that objection to Plato?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's basically, I think, why Glaucon sets up the challenge that he makes to Socrates in the way that he does, right? So he mentions to Socrates that there seem to be three different ways that we welcome things that we think are good in some way or another in our lives. And one of those ways is something that we welcome just because it has some external benefits that don't come with the thing because of the nature of the thing, but that, are like going to the dentist. They're intrinsically something that we wouldn't want. We find them painful and onerous, but they bring us a benefit, right? And that's, of course, the view that Glaucon wants to reject, but it's the view for which he argues, right? And we get, of course, this Gyges ring, which is, Weinstein is sort of someone who you might think has a kind of Gyges ring. He can have a shield of invisibility despite doing nefarious things because he's shielded by his power. So, he's someone who can act just and have, as you say, the reputation for justice. And of course, a big reason why we think that might be bad is that we might get caught. But of course, lots of people don't get caught. And so, the question is Weinstein or someone like that worse off? Because not of any, negative effects that attach to being unjust, but just because of the nature of what injustice is. Because, of course, Glaucon wants Socrates to show, and Socrates believes that justice isn't the kind of thing like going to the dentist that we only welcome because of its effects. And if we could have the effects without it, we would take that.
Right.
If you could go to the dentist if you could have good teeth without going to the dentist, we would choose that. Rather, justice is something that we welcome, both because of what it is, like pleasure, right? No one needs to defend wanting pleasure in their life. Insofar as something's pleasurable, that's a reason why you're reasonable to want it. Maybe all things considered, it's not the thing that you want, but we don't usually ask people to explain to us why something that's pleasant insofar as it's pleasant is worth having. Justice is supposed to be, for Plato, for the Glaucon character, and for the Socrates character, it's supposed to be one of those things. Right. So I think the answer to the Weinstein scenario that we're supposed to have when we understand what Plato's trying to get us to understand is, well, you could have the effects of justice without justice, but that would be like having the effects of health. And we don't just want health because it has positive effects. Health is an intrinsically good state to be in. It's a state that enables us to do what we are, in a sense, supposed to be doing, or what we are really good at, whatever it is in our lives that we could call, the thing that we're best at, or our function, or our characteristic activity, whatever that is. Justice helps us do that better, and that's what happiness is. So, it's really supposed to be, I think, in a way, self-evident, in the same way that the claim that pleasure is good, that justice is good. And, no one who understands what pleasure is, I think, would argue that you need to have some effect that comes from pleasure in order for pleasure to be valuable. Socrates wants to argue the same thing for justice, that it's one of those types of goods. It also, of course, has good effects. And so there's two reasons why you want it. But the most important reason why you want it is going to turn out to have to do with something about the nature of what justice is, not what it is accompanied by, a good reputation. No, it's justice itself is good for you in the same way that pleasure is.
Yeah, so that the person who does behave justly their entire lives is still going to be better off than Harvey Weinstein, even if he was never caught out for what he did.
Yeah, like Harvey Weinstein pre being caught.
Yeah.
Socrates is fond of saying this in other Platonic dialogues and certainly dialogues that are more Socratic, but the Socrates character in all kinds of dialogues says it's actually better to be caught. So in a dialogue called the Gorgias, Socrates says the worst thing that can happen to you is to be an unjust person and not ever be caught. It's always in your interest to be caught if you're unjust, because that's like going to the doctor. Right. So I think Weinstein would be someone who, you could get the superficial look of health by putting on all kinds of makeup or putting on a face. Mind you, I think Weinstein is a bad example because he looks miserable. Like, I mean, I think pre reckoning, Weinstein, like, he looks like a guy that is just a miserable human being. Like,
yeah, but in some ways that makes him he is a good example for Plato, given the way he just describes the tyrannical soul and what ends up happening.
I mean, I agree, but I think if you wanted to look at somebody and say, their life isn't all it's cracked up to be, like, you might think that Harvey Weinstein is, sitting around beaming at his family and looking at closed account books and saying, boy, I'm happy. And I think the reality with Weinstein really belies that image. So, I mean, I think there are better examples, maybe not better examples, but Weinstein to me seems to be like actually someone that Plato would be like, yeah, that's the kind of guy I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like,
well, that's partly what I mean.
Look into his eyes. Like,
yeah.
Not
well, that's why I wanted to choose him in some ways
when he's down, but the guy looks like he looks, I don't know, a bit dead inside. I don't want this to be a bunch of hot takes about how Weinstein appears, but I don't know.
I don't know if I don't think it's controversial at this point to make statements about how bad Harvey Weinstein looks as a person.
So anyway, I'm just saying, like, we imagine, and I think with Weinstein, it's not a great stretch, that this guy is tormented, and that, maybe, and I think I mean, you asked about do we want to believe this? Do I believe it? Maybe even with Weinstein, he's somebody who I do look at and think, I think that he's probably missing some important human values, and that's what enables him, or did enable him, to behave in this awful way. Because it's not just that he was able to get something, sexual pleasure, and that was it. It's rather that, he was able to get that because he didn't respect women as people, and he probably lost a lot of possible fulfillment in life because of that, right? Like, he would have been more fulfilled if he had believed that other people were worthy of better treatment. I mean, that's the type of thing that Plato's going to push.
Yeah. So we'll get to that, but so Plato will say at some point that he'll talk about the tyrannical soul, and he'll say that somebody that's Weinstein, and somebody who is constantly responding to their most base desires is ultimately actually not fulfilling their appetites, right? So I'm using language that will make more sense as we go on through it. But I think that's kind of what you're talking about when you say, like, his values, which on the one hand was about fulfilling his base desires, made it so that his life ultimately was not as fulfilling as it could have been.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, so I think it's right. Like, it isn't as fulfilling, absolutely, hands down. I think it's kind of interesting because he is fulfilling his desires, right? It's not that the tyrannical person doesn't do what they want to. And I mentioned the Gorgias. It's something that's really closely connected to the Republic. And this, in the Gorgias, is exactly how it's put. Like, the person who can manipulate other people, can talk well, has rhetoric, and can cover up for themselves. This person looks like they're doing exactly what they want, right? And Socrates, I won't talk too much about the Gorgias because it's not our topic, but it's just so closely related. Socrates says, the person who is like that, they never do what they want. They do what they desire or what they think they want, but that's not ultimately what they want. And so, Weinstein did, in a sense, do what he wanted. That's precisely the problem, right? He did exactly what he wanted. But I think the Platonic claim would be desires are malleable, and you could have lots of different desire sets, and there's no benefit in giving yourself a desire set that is depraved in certain ways or that is morally perverse. That's going to, when you satisfy it, first of all, be unsatisfiable, right? So there's a last reference to the Gorgias. There's a great image there of someone who makes themselves itch so that they can have the pleasure of scratching. And so, when you give yourself these kinds of unnecessary, Plato says, desires, and especially when you give yourself these unnecessary appetites that are so strong that you need to transgress laws, I think Plato would view that as an addiction. So the point being, you get what you want. And Plato would diagnose a Weinstein as someone who, in fact, puts himself in a position where he has very, very exorbitant wants that no one else has. And he can satisfy them. But nevertheless, it's like that desire set is itself the problem. And even fulfilling that desire set, I think there's a trade-off for Plato. You can have those desires and you can satisfy them, but what are you missing, right? Like having a sensitivity that enables you to be scheming in this way and to be lying in this way, is that something that doesn't affect your values in other ways that, make the world dark? That you live in a world that is a worse place. The world you construct for yourself that you engage with includes lots of failures to recognize value, and that's intimately related to your ability to be awful.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about how he gets to that point, because that's kind of in many ways his close to his end point. So to get to that stage, in order to get to this point where he's talking about how the just person is better off than the not just person, there's a large amount of text devoted towards him talking about a city. So in order to get to the sort of ideal person, he first talks about the ideal city. And as you pointed out the other night when we chatted, he goes through a draft of a city first, and then he gets to the kind of the big conversation, which is, if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, Callipolis.
Yeah, the beautiful or fine city, the Callipolis.
Yeah. So basically, in order to get to that point, he talks about this ideal city, and he's going to then say, well, if this is how a city works, this is kind of how a person works, and therefore we can say, what works for a city works for a person. So let's talk about how he talks about the city. So he says that in order for, I think, let me know if this is wrong, in order for a city to work properly, you need to have basically three kind of classes of people, or three categories of people, who are all doing their own particular work. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely on track. You mentioned the draft city, the first that is built. And depending on how seriously we take the presentation of this city by Socrates as, quote, the healthy city, Socrates says a lot that makes it sound like he actually thinks this is the best city. I bring this up only because that city, I think, doesn't have this regimented class structure with three classes. Right. It has individuals who perform certain functions. And Socrates says they can be as little as 5 people to fulfill the function that this city has, which is basically to make our lives easier, to help us better get the things we need to stay alive. We band up together. In that city, there isn't this regimented social class structure where you have different individuals who do different functions, and because of that have very different lives than other people who don't, right? So like the cobbler in the first city, the so-called simple, healthy city, I don't think this person's life looks very different from, say, the farmer in that city. Whereas this three-part class structure is really something that emerges when the city gets more complicated. And there are more things, especially more material culture, that can either take us in a great direction, but also introduce the possibility of error, right? So I think, at any rate, I think that the first city that's described, and we can say that Plato doesn't talk about it much, so he's not interested in it, but I think there's more going on. At any rate, he envisions there a city that doesn't have this three-part structure.
Yeah.
And so perhaps that's something that, is definitely part of the city that's built and part of its justice, but perhaps we could imagine simpler arrangements that wouldn't, so whether or not having the three-part structure is like the essence of justice is a question. Another reason to sort of question that just a bit is that later on Plato will say, there's a sense in which Socrates will say, there's a soul that's really rational in us, and maybe we have appetite and spirit. Maybe we have desires for pleasure and desires for social recognition because of embodiment. So it might even be that justice for disembodied creatures, for God's sake, if there are such, wouldn't look like the Republic. So both on the simpler end, where the people are living a lifestyle that is far less complicated and far less stratified and regimented, on that end, it may not be that justice requires this class stratification. And in the case of disembodied intellectual beings, it might not. So at both ends, so to speak, it might not. But yeah, I mean, the basic point that yes, justice involves everyone doing what is their own, the thing that best belongs to them. In a simple city, that can be just making shoes and that's it, or it can be you're a soldier, and now it's not just that that's your job. Now that is a kind of livelihood calling, where it sort of orders everything in your life, what you read, what you spend time on, in a different kind of way.
Well, I like you call it a calling, because there is a sort of sense that you have an intrinsic aptitude for these things.
Yeah, absolutely. You have an intrinsic aptitude.
Yeah, and there's not necessarily anything that's going to accurately 100% predict that, although he will say quite often, one class of people is going to beget another class of those same people, but not necessarily.
And remember, in the Republic, the guardian class, they don't know who their family members are. So I think that, there's a genetic aspect, but I'm not sure that Plato is super interested in that. I think he thinks that, generally speaking, perhaps like begets like, and people have children that are like them. But also, I think part of the the construct of people not knowing who their families are might be that it more effectively allows us to choose people on the basis of merit. Right? People can't say, well, this is my son or daughter, and so they ought to be a guardian because I am, and we've always been guardians 20 generations, right? They don't even know that. And so really, the guardian could be the child of a simple cobbler, the next guardian, and no one would know. And I think part of the reason Plato wants no one to know is precisely because I think that maybe he doesn't think that genetics
are going to determine that.
It's not. Yeah, I think it's important. I think it's a good guide, and certainly there's a eugenics program in the Republic, not for no reason. Plato thinks that it's going to help us get the social makeup that we want. But there's a lot of things about astrology, right? Like when people are born and things like that, right? Like I think his understanding of inheritance, I think, is closer to sort of astrological.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think, and maybe these are just myths for Plato, but
So let's talk, because we're talking about the three classes, but we haven't really explained what they are. So you have the guardian class, as you put it, which is basically the kind of what often is to these days gets referred to as the Philosopher King, although that term is not used at least not in the version that I read. But essentially, it's a philosophically minded, rational person who gets to be a guardian. So that's at the top. They're the leaders of the society. You have the auxiliary class, who are like a military, essentially. And then you have the working class, who make up the majority of the society. That's where you have your cobbler and your farmer and people like that. So you have those three classes largely, and the society works as long as everybody is kind of doing their own work.
That's right.
Yeah. So you have that now. So then we'll come back to that, but he basically says that those three elements are essentially at work in every person, right? So everybody has one of those, has all three of those elements in them. You have a philosophical side. You have the auxiliary side gets referred to as a spirited side, which often gets the attribute I think that is most connected with it seems to be anger, but it could be others as well. But and then you have your what he calls your appetitive element, which is like food, drink, sex, but he also uses money making a lot. Largely because it's making money that will allow you to have access to all the other appetites that you want. So you have those three elements within you, but you're inevitably going to have one that dominates. So whoever is the one who's like dominated by the philosophical side will most likely become a guardian, and one who's dominated by their spirited side will become an auxiliary, and somebody who's dominated by their appetitive side will end up in the laborer class. So that's essentially kind of how he's developing the city into the individual. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. So the way that we know what broader class you are supposed to be in is a matter of what part of your soul tends to predominate in you. And so one thing that is important to clarify, I think, is when you say that certain people have an aptitude for a task, of course, we think immediately intellectual aptitude, maybe, or athletic aptitude. And of course, that's part of it. The people who are philosopher kings or who are guardians, they're people that are generally good at learning. But I think a lot of the picture that we get is actually more about what are your values? What is it that you work for? What is it that gratifies you? What is it that gives you pleasure? I think for Plato, those things are just as important, or arguably even more important, than any particular skills that you might apply to neutrally to a bunch of different lives. Right. So it's not so much that someone's clever and that makes them a philosopher. That's part of it. But really, the philosopher is someone who has values that would actually make them satisfied with that life. The moneymaker is somebody that has values that would make them satisfied with that type of life. Right. So, the idea that one part of the spirit predominates, the moneymaker wouldn't be happy, I think, in Plato's mind, with the philosophic life, because their value set is skewed in terms of appetitive satisfaction. And, that's what enables them to work in the field and get money, as opposed to studying with the philosophers. They don't find what the philosophers do perhaps to be very enjoyable, and they find making money to be gratifying and the things that you can buy with money. If the philosophers had that temperament, they would become tyrannical, probably, right? Like they would only see the point of philosophizing as perhaps trying to get more of those kinds of things. So, when I said a calling, that's what I was thinking. And like when you think of calling nowadays, you usually say like a priest, or like a monk or something. It's like
Right.
a priest isn't just a priest because they have some intellectual talent. This person is committed to values that would allow them to take a position that's really connected to a whole way of life.
Yeah. Well, and I guess ideally for Plato, that society is not going to be a coercive one. It's actually going to be a society in which people are going to want to be in these positions, right? And
that's what Plato thinks. Yeah.
That's what Plato thinks. And you can also think, like, if he thinks that that's the way people are, that people are either naturally more leaning towards their philosophical side or leaning more towards their appetitive side, if that's the way people are generally, then you could see why he would imagine an ideal state would look like this and would not be coercive, because it just speaks to the way he sees that that's how people are in general.
Yeah, that's right. I think he would say, in a way, in my city, everyone does what they most want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone not only does the task that they're most suited for in the sense of intellectual ability, but the task that they're temperamentally most well suited for.
Right. So in that sense, it is like a lot of sort of political ideology, which is based on this idea that an ideal society is one in which responds to human nature in some ways, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
you find that is true with sort of like capitalist libertarians. It's true with socialists. It's true with communists, and it seems to be true with Plato as well. That this is just the way this speaks to the way that people are, and therefore people are going to naturally sort of want. It's almost as if things were kind of left to nature, this is kind of the way things would go.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that speaks to the idea that this is not coercive. I think that when you read it, it's very easy to think there's a lot of oppression in this society, but rightly or wrongly, Plato doesn't, I think, imagine it that way. That can sometimes appear even more terrifying, right? Like you have all these people that are, you would say, maybe brainwashed, and they say, no, we like it here. Like, this is how we like it, sir. Like, it's like,
right.
There's a bit of something almost more frightening when it's like, wow, they've even gotten into your minds now. But, right. Plato, I think, takes very seriously the idea that we are malleable. And when we have certain desires as readers, and certainly when his contemporaries had certain desires as readers that would make them reject the Republic, Plato will probably be someone who says, well, that's part of the sort of ideology that you've absorbed as being part of a democratic regime. Democracy has its own set of values that it posits as being the most important. You're not going to get that here. You're not going to get complete autonomy in the sense that you are used to seeing it, meaning I can do what I want when I want it, as long as I'm not hurting anyone. Plato says, no, I'm going to tell you what ideally you want, and you're going to agree. And I don't think he imagines that as coercion in most instances. It's almost like we all have, experience of being mistaken about what will make us happy. And sometimes we think something is going to be satisfying to a certain amount or for a certain time period, and then it isn't. Right. And so, is it better for us, for example, to be able to continue to amass consumer goods in the belief that they are making us happier? Maybe they're not. And so maybe when we are given a chance to live Plato's society, we'll say, actually, what I was trying to do when I was getting those things was fill a hole in me that is now being better filled without them. So, Plato believes that we can get it terribly, terribly wrong, I think, and that our society can be like the cave, right? We can have all kinds of false views about what human beings are that come from puppet shows that we're watching, and that don't actually allow us to live the lives that would be most satisfying, because we don't know who we are, in a sense.
So along those lines, actually, because you said before, it is. I agree with you when you say that, to be the guardian, the philosopher king, that you're going to have a certain set of values that's going to make you want to be in that position. But it also means that you have a particular kind of insight into the real world or the truth that other people don't necessarily have. And right. And that's where this idea of the cave comes in, which is probably the most iconic aspect of this book. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that, to how the cave plays in and how that relates to the way that the guardian philosopher is this person who has insight into the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the cave allegory, I mean, it's well enough known that I think you don't need to say a lot to introduce it. But, the idea is that we are given a certain parable, a certain comparison, an image, it's called, that's going to give us a picture of what our situation is like on Earth. And I think one important thing to recognize about this picture is I don't think that Plato thinks the end game is that everyone is busted out of the cave and nobody is watching a puppet show in the dark anymore. I think that this is actually part of the human condition, and puppet shows are always going to be part of it. So the people who are watching the puppet shows, I think, are people who would fit into the perhaps productive and certainly the auxiliary class, the military class. So the cave idea is supposed to teach us what learning is like. And I think that it shows us a picture of human life that can be a bit frightening, because for many, many people, the only idea that they have access to about, say, what they are comes not from their own free reflection on what they are, but through images that are manufactured by someone else. And so this is the idea, I think, of the puppet show. These people haven't ever seen a human being. That, in Plato's mind, would be like seeing the form of humanity, which is what a philosopher wants and what we ideally want to do. They've only seen what they've been told being a human being is, right? So when they think, what's a happy person look like? They might say, well, that's like Joey from Friends. And what is an ideal human being like? Well, that's like Joey from Friends, right? So they have association.
It's all Joey from Friends, no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, well, Joey looks like a person that is happy. I guess. It's like, and there's so much to talk about. It's hard not to say too much or change the topic. But the cave parable it's not just sort of something that gets introduced. It's really integrated into the book, in the sense that the way that characters such as Cephalus and Polemarchus, who are in the first book but not later, and Adeimantus, the way that they speak when they try to talk about justice is largely through cultural representations. All right, so a good argument for Cephalus that is supposed to ground the correctness of his view of justice. He says, here's what justice is. How do I know this? Well, this is like this saying. This is like this play. This is like what this god did. Right? And so his view of justice, that, ultimately you want to pay back to people what you owe them, and you want to give good sacrifices to the gods. That's a view that he has arrived at because his culture has presented it to him. And so, long story short, you get the cave parable sort of not quite in the middle, but 3/4 of the way through. And it both allows us to understand the approach taken to these philosophical topics by characters that, sort of live on the level of cultural representations, and say justice is Joey and Chandler splitting the new couch properly. And then later we have these censorship rules that are going to be, and earlier, that are going to affect the kind of art we experience, and also the stories that we're told and the religion that we have. And I think, the cave shows us why those censorship rules are so important. Because in fact, many people always get their vision of justice in that way. And like I said, I don't think that ideally we're supposed to imagine someone saying, let's get the hell out of here, busting everyone out and taking them all up to the light. There are going to be people that are going to be given certain stories that communicate to them what justice is. And I think Plato thinks for those people, that's always going to be a feature of their lives.
Yeah, because he seems to suggest that, every time he talks about the cave, it's always one person who escapes. And then that one person is going to come back every now and then, talk to the people, and then leave again. So I think that makes sense. Now, so that does lead us to this one, because I read Plato, and it's such a intriguing book, because on the one hand, I find myself agreeing with Plato a lot in terms of what he's saying, but on the other hand, there's things that I just fundamentally disagree with him on. Some of which you just kind of talked about there in the last few minutes. And actually, I feel now I have to actually reload this up, but I'm going to share a few minutes or just a minute really of a video, my discussion on the Iliad from a few weeks ago. So this is before I read any Plato whatsoever. This is me talking about Homer's Iliad. There is a tremendous amount of extreme violence in the Iliad. One wonders if, let's say, Homer was blamed in his day, rather misplaced blame on Homer for the violence in ancient Greek society. It's all because of the Iliad that people are going out there and fighting. Okay. Did you hear that? Did that come through?
I did.
All right. Good. So I play that because Plato actually talked about Homer a lot in the Republic. And he doesn't outright say what I just suggested, that the reason people are fighting is because of Homer, although he kind of veers towards it a little bit. But he does say, Homer is a problem because those texts are a problem, along with most poetry and most kind of creative works, because he's talking to the poets and the playwrights, because they don't show the truth, but also because they represent the world in a way that's just not sending a good message for young people. Actually, in some respects, I read the Republic and think sometimes Plato seems like he would fit in really well in the humanities department, in terms of some of the things that he's saying. Because children are not, he says at one point, children are not able to understand allegory, that we need to get rid of a lot of these sort of representations, because we shouldn't see the gods fighting with each other. We shouldn't see people, really crying when they're mourning after their loved ones. We shouldn't see this. We shouldn't see that. It's bad for the youth. It gives them bad role models, essentially. These are arguments that we hear a lot, that we've been hearing a lot all of our lives. Video games give us bad role models, things like that. There's an element of that in Plato, and so he does suggest really outlawing a lot of literature, except for that which does kind of speak the truth in terms of those who are seeing the world beyond the confines of the cave.
Yeah.
So that part of Plato, I do take a bit of an issue with, and this was something that I kept bringing up in our conversation the other night. And actually, I want to read this quote here. This time, I'm going to try and actually find it. Even the Philosopher King, the guardians, should not see bad representations in their lives. Rather, here I'm quoting, he must have trained himself over many years to discern how naturally bad it is by using his own theoretical knowledge, not his own intimate experience of it. And it struck me as I was reading that, how is he going to know how bad people act without ever having seen any example of it? He's just supposed to imagine it in his head.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm always of the opinion that, the more that you see, the better it is, because you're able to actually, make choices and see how bad people act and how good people act and so on. Plato does not take that view at all.
No, and it gets back to, you've mentioned that it's not just the city that has this three-part structure, and it's not just justice in a city, which is everyone doing the work that they are best suited for and sticking to the class that they quote unquote belong in because of their natural inclinations. That's also the way that our souls look. The thing in us that gets us to move, that can cognize truth, and can, get us to go after things or to go away from things. That thing for Plato is also made of three parts. And that's really, I think, the crucial piece in his view of censorship. So I think, we'll probably end up getting into the three-part soul in some detail later. But, for now, it's worth saying that I think that the reason why Plato isn't optimistic in the way that you are about exposing people to more, say, information, is that Plato really is someone, I think, who thinks, in this case, the medium is the message in a certain way. So there's a certain kind of gratification that we get from art for Plato. And he thinks that just by nature, art is the kind of art that he's talking about, Homer and playwrights and things like that. The best comparison for us would be not Homer, but films or advertising, right? I mean, that's an important thing that's often raised, and it is very important that we ought not to think that Plato is talking about book clubs, right? Plato is talking about the dominant intellectual and not just intellectual, but like entertainment culture of his days. These plays that he's discussing were parts of grand religious festivals. They were competitive, and they weren't just sort of something that you would read within the, safety of a university classroom. You would be seeing this in something like a cinema. And Plato thinks that the representations that are given to us in those art forms speak directly to parts of us that are not rationally critical. So we kind of absorb them. It gets under the guardian in our soul, right? It kind of bypasses our normal ability to question, is this correct or not? And when a film, I talk about film because it's sort of the best analog. But when a playwright, and even more so when a filmmaker, when an artist presents reality, there is a certain possibility for artifice. Like art is artifice. It can be artificial. And so, the problem with Plato isn't that violence is being depicted. It's really, I think, that people are depicted acting in unjust ways and being happy. It's like if we watched movies about Weinstein, your guy Harvey.
Well, don't call him my guy Harvey.
that showed him.
I don't want to be loaded up with that guy.
All right. That showed him being happy, right? That he has this great life. And, if we watched enough of that, Plato would think people are going to believe, because they want to believe, that is actually true, that Weinstein has this fairy tale existence. And Plato thinks that precisely is the problem, is that the artist has access to artifice and is doing something that is not by nature something that we engage with critically. We sort of just get swept up in the story. And the other thing, there's so much to talk about that I always get worried, am I taking it too far? But the other thing is that art, if you look at what is popular, Plato is onto something. What is popular isn't the work that shows someone who is rational and cool, navigating their life in ways that minimize vice, because that's not terribly interesting. by nature, drama takes place on a stage, and we want drama, right? We don't want to see a play about Pericles just sort of sitting there and thinking for 10 hours and then, coolly doing something without much unnecessary drama, without gnashing his teeth or wailing or whatever, just making the right decision and then sitting there contentedly. We don't want to see a film about someone using their theoretical intellect for 10 hours, right? Like we want to see Snooki or we want to see visions of humanity that appeal to what Plato thinks the art itself is appealing to by nature.
Right? Well, and you see, that's partly where I do agree with Plato, right? Because I do think that, I think that, as we were saying the other night, I think that people probably would be generally more satisfied if they engaged with cultural artifacts that I personally think are more beneficial. Now, maybe that's just my subjective opinion. That's weighing heavily on that. But, do I think people would be more satisfied, generally speaking, if they regularly read things like Crime and Punishment or, Franz Kafka or War and Peace and watched, Ingmar Bergman films and things like that? I mean, yeah, I do. I think that people generally would feel better about things and feel more satisfied and all of those things. So I'm except that I don't think Plato would accept those actual texts as being legitimate either. But I do agree in some sense that the cultural artifacts that we consume do impact us in some significant ways. I'm just not prepared to say, well, given that that's the case, let's force people to only read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Ingmar Bergman. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of, I think there are many parts to our rejection of state censorship as a meaningful solution or something that should be allowed. I mean, one of them is just a concern for liberty and freedom and autonomy. One of the ideas is someone can't tell me what I'm going to consume.
Right.
But there's also another issue, which is more than that, which I think is more than just a kind of knee-jerk desire to not have other people tell you what to do, because we certainly don't like other people telling us what to do. There's also a kind of assumption that's made on the part of the would-be censor, and Plato is definitely in this camp, that the way that we're engaging with this art is very literal. And I think in Plato, you have one of the beauties, I think, of studying Plato is that he really is such a good archetype for this type of person. He makes clear that he's making the kinds of assumptions that people that are generally pro this kind of censorship make. Chiefly, that the way that we engage with artistic representations is primarily one of imitation. And imitation is a really fundamental category for Plato, which I think is part of why he's so interested in art. But ultimately, if we're good people, we're imitating the forms. And the universe imitates the forms. The universe has a rational structure in the way that it does because the universe is in some way or another responding to intellectual truths, the forms. And that's why things have order. And Plato thinks that when we watch art, part of the reason we're not able to watch these different artistic representations is because that's a way of not sticking to your job. You will start to become, you'll start to think that you've had the experiences of that person. And not only that, the primary idea in art is that we are presenting things as models for imitation. Right. So, if someone says you ought to be censored, you can't watch that thing. A lot of times the most egregious cases where it's like, well, you just don't know what you're talking about, are cases that involve something like humor or something that's particularly sophisticated, right? Like if you make a satirical representation, there are definitely people, and unfortunately this is becoming more and more of a thing. There are people who think that because you are watching someone who says X, you are therefore endorsing X. When in
Right.
fact, the representation of X might be deliberately negative.
Right.
And so, I mean, Plato just seems to think that we are always cheering for the protagonist,
Yeah.
that there can't be a protagonist that is showing us anything other than a model for emulation. And I
Right.
mean, I think that Plato's on good ground if you look at most popular art. Like in most cases, you don't get a character that's not meant to be emulated. I mean, that's why I bring up Joey Tribbiani, because I do think that Friends
I like how
is
you remember his whole name. That's good. That's
yeah. I don't. I mean, yeah. It's burned into me. I mean, Plato's right about
sure.
it. No, I
Sure.
haven't watched the
Absolutely.
show in a long time, but I think that show is particularly, and reality TV is in fact, there are of course people who the Jersey Shore is another show that I reference. Like that's a show where people definitely don't watch it thinking, I ought to be Snooki. Maybe some people do, but Plato, I think, thinks that that's the response. Whether or not we think we have a critical distance, we are responding to it in some way on that level.
I think that you're right. I think that it's true of most popular culture, and I think that maybe explains why there's so much confusion over when you have a more complicated, complex piece of art where
Right.
you're showing a character that you're meant to be a little bit ambivalent about. Not even just saying like I'm meant to dislike this character, because then that's also there is that, and that's kind of easy as well. Like characters who
Yeah.
are
Yeah.
that you're meant to hate, but characters that are a little bit ambivalent, like most of Dostoevsky's characters, or
Yeah.
like Kafka's characters. Am I supposed to like this guy? Am I supposed to be
Right.
on his side? Am I not supposed to like this guy?
Right.
That's you don't see that as much in most pop culture.
Yeah. And so I think that if Plato were able to respond to our criticisms, I think one direction that he might take that would be Platonic might be something like, well, the kind of art that you're describing perhaps is different than the kind of art that I'm describing. Now, I do
Right.
think that Plato is probably not going to be uh, so satisfying to us in this way. And I think a lot of times he'll think you think you're engaging with that with some critical distance. But I mean, it's not that Plato bans stories. Plato does allow stories. It's just
Hmm.
that they have to represent things in a certain way. So I think Plato would have no problem showing certain characters in Bergman. There are emotionally very miserable characters who are psychologically uh, deeply unhappy, and
Hmm.
we would say in some ways they have issues, right?
Hmm.
They have issues, and as long as we're not showing those individuals as living a carefree, happy life, which Bergman certainly doesn't, um, I think Plato might even think that some of these things could be positive. Now, there's a certain, uh, decadent emotionalism to something like Bergman that Plato wouldn't like, right? Like these people shouldn't be tearing their clothing and weeping all the time. That's an inappropriate response. They need to leave the country house on the island and go out and make a difference and stop being so negative. But I do think that if a kind of art does operate on a level that allows for true thinking, then I don't think that Plato would have
Right.
a objection to it.
It's just that Faroe Island is so incredible
Yeah, exactly.
in those
It is.
films.
It is. It is.
Um,
But I mean, that's
no, it's a good
a
point.
philosopher king that doesn't want to leave the cave.
Yes, that's true. That is true. So, well, I hadn't considered that, but I like this idea that Callipolis might allow for some films from the Ingmar Bergman filmography. I like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got to remember that Plato is doing something artificial, and I think he knows that, right? Plato is
Right.
writing a dialogue, and I think Plato is worried about the artists principally as a competitor. because there are two ways that you can think that you're getting truths about reality. One of them is to do philosophy, which is very difficult, not very emotionally appealing, and doesn't tend to produce strong emotional states. And so for that reason isn't very exciting. Right? There's a reason why if someone says, what movie do you want to see? Most people aren't going to say Bergman or anything that is dry. Like you're not going to say, let's, like on Friday night, let's just read The Republic. Right. But I think Plato ideally would like that to be the way the conversation ends. Right. And so it's like, it's a competitor. And so, for that reason, I think that it would be wrong to think that Plato likes storytelling. He respects storytelling.
He certainly read a lot of it.
Yeah, he's read a lot of it. And I think he's aware of its power. And that's precisely why he's afraid of it and why he thinks that it shouldn't be just something that's there that the state doesn't have any say over.
Right. That's very interesting. I like that. Because you can see that a lot in terms of, you work in a university, I work in a university, and you can even just see, just in terms of department by department, how each department will have its own argument as to why the thing that they study is the thing that everybody should be studying. So I think to see Plato in that light, I think that makes a lot of sense. That helps in my reading of him, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the things too on this line that's really important is that Plato really is inventing the discipline of philosophy in the Republic. So there's another figure, Isocrates, very closely named to our own Socrates, with the letter I in front, who also had a vision of what we might call philosophy looks like. And it is more about not studying these arcane philosophical forms. It's more about dealing well with appearances, making good judgments based on, things perhaps even like artistic understanding. So Plato is trying to sketch out this new type of activity that we might engage in instead of going to the movies, or that at any rate is going to be done in our society and is going to affect the content of the entertainment we watch. But I think Plato is trying to say, look, prior to this, you thought that the way to get truth was to attend theatrical festivals. So there are these figures in Plato's discussion of the forms that are called the lovers of sights and sounds. And the way that these individuals are described, it's often pointed out that, these aren't necessarily people that just like to look at sunsets. These are people that are culturally involved. And so the lovers of sights and sounds in the discussion of the difference between philosophy and this kind of belief that philosophy is meant to replace in many people. They're supposed to get rid of that way of forming beliefs and do philosophy. The sort of bad guy or the bad person in that story is precisely the person who goes to all these theater festivals and thinks that they know human life because they've seen lots of performances.
Right.
And Plato was going to say, well, look, isn't there something about the dramatic medium that makes you gravitate towards certain kinds of stories, right? Isn't there a reason why these stories all have the same structure? Yes, because that's what works in that format. And if you make a play of the sort that would be philosophical, this is a good suggestion. I don't remember who first made it, but there have been a few people who have tried fruitfully to talk about Plato's dialogue form as a kind of drama, as the kind of ideal drama that Plato would think might replace theatrical performances.
Interesting. And that's how I read it, actually, because the version that I read was written as a dialogue.
Yeah, and Plato writes in a format that is identical. It tries to be identical. Of course, it isn't, because it's a philosophical treatise at this point as well, which is why we get Glaucon, who's not a great character.
Right.
But Plato is trying to put what he's doing in that form.
Right.
And so he's replacing a normal film where, Glaucon would come to Socrates and say, Socrates, you're coming with me. I've got a gun. Like, you're coming back to our house. You talked about the sort of threat of violence there. It could have been a very different thing imagine that Weinstein took the Republic and said, I've got the rights to this. Let's make it. We're
Right.
going to get Tarantino to shoot it, right?
Right.
It's going to, in translation to a film or a movie or a stage production, it's probably going to change quite a bit.
Yeah.
Right. At best, it looks like Dead Poets Society. Right. At best,
Right.
it has all kinds of drama that aren't part of the learning experience that are appealing.
Yes.
Or Dangerous Minds. At worst, it looks like Die Hard, right? Like by the time that the producers get done with it, knowing what they know about how to make money at the box office, it's not going to emerge unscathed as a Republic.
Yeah. So anybody who hasn't read it, Plato does not have anybody stand up on tables. He doesn't bring in any Bob Dylan lyrics.
Nothing
like that.
But I think that's a good way to think about what Plato's rejecting. He obviously isn't rejecting the Republic, right? One of the things.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one thing that's off topic, and I kind of wondered whether to bring it up. But there's a whole a tradition of interpreting Plato that goes back to Leo Strauss that really thinks that what Plato is doing in the Republic is another kind of myth making that takes very seriously the idea that, because Plato draws a distinction between kinds of lies that are in fact good and kinds of lies that aren't. And there's a kind of noble lie. And in fact, it's kind of like, this isn't the way the gods are. But even if they were, we wouldn't want people to see this. So the people who are doing the censoring, they're not necessarily, there's a sort of conflation between what is useful for people to hear and what is true. Right. What turns out to be true and what is useful, especially when talking about the gods, the divine, the heroes, those things in Plato's mind are kind of, there's not much of a distinction.
Right.
And he says some interesting things, which is like, sometimes he says they're true. Sometimes he says it's true, even if it's false. Like he refers to these stories as kinds of true falsehoods, which is interesting. I mean, I wonder if part of his willingness to do this really tells us something very interesting about Greek religion, because I think one of the things that we often wonder about Greek religion is, like, did people believe that Homer was writing in the same way that people might think that, the Apostle Paul was writing? Like, what is the status of this? There were competing myths about all these characters. Like, did people think that Homer was gospel? And I think that part of the puzzle of trying to see what the attitude looked like might even involve looking at Plato. Like, Plato has an attitude where it's kind of like, well, maybe the god did this, maybe not. Would it be good for the god to have done this? If so, then the god did it. I don't know. There seems to be a certain looseness with, I don't know. Plato's not a fundamentalist.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. He wants representations that are good. That he sees are good, and he'll call those representations truth sometimes. But the main thing is that they're good models for people.
That's right. And I think that in the book 1 of Republic, we get these definitions of justice that don't, I think, ultimately go away. They look like they might, but the idea that Cephalus has, the first person who's asked what justice is, the character Cephalus says, well, justice is telling the truth and giving to others what you owe to them. Right. Well, I think Plato's ultimate definition of justice has those elements. They just look very different. What the truth is no longer what is literally true. And also what you owe to someone is no longer a question of what you literally owe them as a matter of historical facts. What contracts have you made? What have you borrowed? Instead, it's a question that's to be decided by normative considerations, like what is best for people to know. And that becomes, so I think Plato might even say that I am giving to people what you owe to them. What you owe to somebody is precisely what it is that they need to do the job that they're best at. And I care a lot about distributive justice. I just don't think that everyone has access in virtue of the kinds of considerations that you do to the same resources. I don't think that fairness, as you understand it, is the way to figure out what is owed to somebody. The guardians won't have any property at all, and they arguably do the most important job.
So
anyway,
all
true,
this,
true.
all that in some ways kind of confirms what you said a while back now, which is to say that, the Guardians, it's mostly about sort of what their values are, and in some ways that's kind of what it is.
Absolutely.
Like when Plato says, you turn somebody away from in the cave towards the light, and that's what education is, basically, to turn them towards the light. It's in some ways you could read that as turning them towards what the actual truth is, but it's kind of more like turning them towards what is right and what is wrong. It's an awareness of what is right and what's
Absolutely.
wrong.
Yeah, and that's really good. You've picked up on something that's really central to the allegory of the cave, right? And that's that education is not a matter of putting content into someone's mind; it's a matter of orienting them.
Right. Yeah. Which his point about education throughout the book is also, I find, really aligns with my own, because he talks about how, you never really get educated if it's forced on you. Because at one point he's talking about how I can't get into this too much because it's beyond my sphere of knowledge. But he talks about how calculation and geometry are ideal things to educate people in, and he says that calculation, geometry, and all the preparatory education that serves as preparation for dialectic must be offered to them in childhood, and not in the shape of compulsory education either, because a free person should learn nothing slavishly. For while compulsory physical labors do no harm to the body, no compulsory instruction remains in the soul. Do not use compulsion to train the children in these subjects. Use play instead. That's a very kind of contemporary view of education to some degree.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is, mind you, the Guardian's education. And when we get to the soldier class, what is described there is not called learning. It's something a lot more like indoctrination, right? It's like dyeing a piece of cloth or wool.
Yes.
And
Yes.
in that case, it isn't. It doesn't look voluntary. Maybe it is, because even then, you're not just drilling truths about justice into the heads of the young. You are telling them stories, right? And presumably that involves making it exciting.
Yes.
You're going to have a story about a mythological character that you're interested in, and not just writing sort of like Bart Simpson, like lines on the board, and that's how your learning takes place.
They're going to want to get out there on the field.
Yeah, so I think Plato always is interested, or he's always aware that like there's a play aspect to learning, and that there's an aspect where you're not learning unless you're enthralled.
Yeah. Well, let's hop towards the three aspects of the soul.
All right.
So just as he will say, a city is best organized in this grander example in terms of the philosophical class, the auxiliary class, and the money making class, or the laboring class. You have these similarly organized three aspects of the soul: the kind of knowledge oriented, the spirited oriented, and the appetitive oriented. And just as in an ideal city, the philosophically, and here's another issue, obviously, because the thing about Plato is he has this bit where he talks about other kinds of societies and how they're not good. So he talks about oligarchies, tyrannies. He's anti-tyranny, but he's also anti-democracy at the same time. He will say in an ideal city, when somebody's who is more oriented in terms of their appetitive element, they need somebody who's more philosophically oriented to basically take control of them, to keep them in line. But he will also say that in an ideal person, your philosophical element is going to temper your appetitive element. Do I have that basically correct?
Yeah, that the ways in which you will take gratification from the appetitive aspect of your life will be organized and limited and bounded by our intellectual part. So, you're still going to have that part of you, and it's still going to participate in your overall life experience and provide you gratification. But you want to eat not just for pleasure, but because you recognize objectively that, say, eating has a certain role in your life. And so you can take pleasure in a meal, but you don't want to take pleasure to such an extent that now eating is holding an improper role in your life.
Right. But and only the person who's more philosophically oriented is able to experience all of these things, right? For the most part.
That's right. Yeah, the person who has a philosophic soul also has appetites, and also has, to some extent, spirit. So there are these three aspects of the soul. You mentioned earlier that spirit is associated with anger. Really, that's right. It's associated with anger because it's associated with social reputational considerations, right? So spirit is the part of us that wants to be seen and recognized and wants to be respected. And so the picture of anger that you get from Plato and also Aristotle is that anger is a desire to take a kind of revenge on someone who has shown you an inappropriate level of respect. So someone disses you. Anger responds to that because anger is something that has as its goal being a kind of person that other people respect and that can be respected. And that can be both honor and pride. It can be being motivated by shame to avoid certain behaviors. There are things that give us lots of pleasure, but that we don't do. And we don't do them principally because we're ashamed of them. There are other things that cause us pleasure that we don't do, and it's because we recognize rationally that maybe they're bad. That's what Plato would say. So anyway, we have these three parts of soul, just to get them on the table. We have appetite, which goes after as its object pleasure. And appetite doesn't have a capacity to reason in itself. If it is doing something like reasoning, that's because it sort of hijacked the function of our rationality. And now rationality has been enslaved to try to get what appetite wants. So there's appetite, which goes after pleasure, and it cognizes value in the world through pleasure. Then we have spirit, which goes after honor, which wants to be honorable. And that's how it understands value. That's how it responds to value. And then, of course, we have reason, which goes after two things: the truth and what is objectively good. And so, these are the three. And I think the best way to think of these is they're differentiated in terms of what objects they respond to.
Right. But the spirited element, that the middle one, is pretty much always working in the service. If it's working in the service of either the rational or the appetitive one, it's actually working in the service of the rational one.
Yeah, ideally and by nature, it is allied in the same way that the soldier class is allied with the guardians. So in the ideal circumstances, and in fact, more often than not, we're more often than not ashamed because we do something that we think rationally is objectively wrong than we are for, say, failing to take a pleasure that we knew was wrong. Right. So again, just as a matter of fact, those two elements tend to work in tandem. There's a close relationship between them.
Yeah, which I think is that's a really great point that Plato makes, right? It's true. It's like we rarely, well, I don't know if I should say it's true, but it does strike me as being true, where we're rarely kicking ourselves for not doing this really awful thing. Rather, it's the opposite, that we're kicking ourselves for not having prevented ourselves from doing this really awful thing.
That's right. And ideally, that's both the case naturally, and ideally, of course, what we want is for our spirit to be backing up our reason. That's what justice looks like. That's why justice is each part doing its own. The role that spirit is most appropriately able to play is precisely that one.
Right. And so then it strikes me that so he reaches this point then where it's like, well, it pays to be the just person, because the person who's not just is somebody who's going to be letting their appetitive element run rampant, and they'll never really be able to experience all three of these things, and they'll never be able to experience what true wisdom is. But at least the person who experiences true wisdom will also be able to experience enjoying, pleasure and things like that, just in a more tempered way. So that's kind of where he ultimately gets to at the end of it. Is that would that be right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And philosophy is said to bring us the most satisfying pleasures. And so the ideal life turns out to be the most pleasant. Uh, Presumably, it also uses our desire for respect in the most appropriate way,
Yeah.
and it is the most rational. So it's kind of
Right.
like no matter who you are, if it's possible for you to be a philosopher king, that will actually bring you more pleasure than the life that you think might bring you pleasure, the
Right.
life of untrammeled desire fulfillment.
Right.
And so it's kind of like no matter who you are, if you understand things properly, you will see that this life is best for you. It best uses the capacities you have. And these capacities are part of your nature, and you can't get rid of that. And so the idea is I can show you a type of life that would best utilize your abilities and best satisfy the kind of yearning that you have to realize yourself. Because
Right.
that's the fundamental thing. We haven't talked about it so much, but there's a big focus on function, work or function. And if you want to know what justice is, justice turns out to be what enables us to function well, because that's what virtues are, right? So the virtue of a knife, it is said, would be sharpness.
Hmm.
And so you can't know what it would be for something to be a good knife. And if there was a sense in which knives could be said to be doing well or to have interest, now there's not, because they're not conscious and they don't really have goals. But if they did, doing well for a knife would be, to be, say, a ginsu. And it has certain virtues like sharpness. And the point is, if you don't know what a knife is, you can't say what virtues a knife will have. And that's why we're building this city, right?
Yeah.
Because we're going to have a city. And notice when they bring the city up, when Glaucon builds his city, and then when Plato builds, or Socrates builds his first simple city and then his bigger city, the cities that they build are always governed to some extent by an understanding of what cities do for us, what their function is, right? So
Right.
Glaucon says everyone is trying to get more and more. Everyone in a state of nature is trying their best to satisfy all of these desires that never really can be satisfied, and that makes us antagonistic to one another. We're at each other's throats, and because of that, justice can play a certain function in human life, right? So Glaucon starts with a picture of what human beings are like. Therefore, what does justice do for us? Well, it allows us to not be harming and killing each other all the time. We all want to do that, but no one likes to be wronged themselves. And so we agree, okay, like this is not working out.
Right.
It would be great if I could just wrong you and you couldn't wrong me, but that can't happen. And so, what I'm getting at is that there's always this desire to see something like justice in terms of its function in our lives, and that's going to depend a lot on what we are. And so when Socrates gets around to introducing why we have a city, his picture is very different. It's in fact that we're trying in the state of nature to meet only basic necessity needs. And he doesn't think that we're out there trying to grab as much as we can. We're just trying to eat as much as we can to stay alive, have enough shelter. And so for Socrates, the city in both cases is a cooperative endeavor, right? It's something that helps us better be the kinds of things that we are. Whereas for Glaucon, and certainly for Thrasymachus, but Glaucon's position isn't that different than Thrasymachus's, I think. It's, in their case, a perversion of our nature, right? It's like we
Right.
do it because we would rather not suffer. But ultimately, the fullest realization of the nature we have for those two fellas is going to be not being just. It's going to be the person, like you said, who gets away with it. So anyway, this is just a long sort of excursion to try to make the point that the reason why we're interested in what the soul looks like and what the city looks like is because we need to understand what those things do in our lives and how they do it to understand how they would be best set up.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. That's great.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I don't I don't know if I mean those are all the things that I wanted to talk about, I think. But are there things that we didn't talk about this book that you want to also
Um,
discuss?
I don't know. I feel like I am belying the title of the podcast and talking too much myself, and I feel like Jay Hutch. So
No,
the one
this
thing
is
that
perfect.
there are a couple things that I feel like obligated to communicate about the Republic.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things that I think when people are reading the Republic for the first time, they might be inclined to think that I think aren't necessarily true and maybe aren't the most helpful way to approach the text. So one of them, which we didn't touch on now, is why are we building this city?
Mm-hmm.
And as I said to you when we were talking about this, I think we're best the best way to view what Plato is doing maybe isn't in line with something like Thomas More's Utopia, where we're trying to have a genre of utopian literature. Of course, even Thomas More's Utopia is not supposed to exist, right? That's the point.
Yes.
But
Yes.
for Plato, the city, I think, is constructed for a reason. We want to see this city, not because we want to say, like, what can we make that would be the best? That isn't unrelated. But the reason why we get down this road is that we want to find justice in a human soul.
Right.
And Socrates says, well, look, the human soul is something that is smaller and, it's not even really visible. If justice exists in a city, which it seems to, because we call cities just, Plato thinks, well, it's going to be easier to see there.
Right.
And Socrates assumes, which I think is something that many of us would think is a bit odd, and I think even in Plato's time probably might have seemed odd. Socrates assumes that if a city is just and a soul is just, they have to have the same thing.
Right.
There's some structural or formal thing that's going on in either case that's identical. And that's a weird assumption to make, simply because it might be that justice in an individual and a justice in a city are related, but not the same at all. Maybe justice in a person is having an ordered soul, and justice in a city is having a city with mostly people who have that ordered soul, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. So you can have relationships between calling cities just and people just that don't require you to assume that they have the same form, the same structural thing going on. And I think those are actually more reasonable in many cases, right? I think people often would think that one of these two types of justice, civic justice or individual justice, is primary, and the other one kind of gets a definition based on that.
Yeah.
Plato thinks, no, they're the same. And so we're building this city to see justice in the soul. The other two things quickly, when talking about the soul, I think it's very tempting for students to think that Plato just says this stuff about the soul because he's got the stuff about the city in his mind. And so it's a bit of like a Just So story where it's like, oh, look, the soul turns out to be also something with three parts. Isn't
Just
that
like
coincidental?
right.
But I think that actually Plato probably, I think, if anything, thought the thing about the soul first. So that's another quick thing that I think when you're reading it, it's good to see that Plato has an argument for the soul having three parts that he thinks is independently good. It's not just like, well, we have these different types of cities. He says there's different people that we call their country spirited, like the Spartans say, and we have other people that we call them wise, like the Athenians. That's not his argument for the three-part soul. His argument for the three-part soul is that we often find ourselves doing things when we think rationally, that's not the thing that I should be doing. So anyway, the other thing that I didn't get to talk about, which I think is really the beauty, but also the difficulty, is obviously forms are a big part of all of this.
And so just pause on that for a second, because I think that I just want to just respond to what you just said, because I mentioned in our last conversation that, I had this underlying question throughout a lot of the text as I was reading it, which is this just a kind of coded way of Plato saying this is what I think in an ideal society should look like? But the more we've talked about it, and I think this conversation tonight has really cleared up that I really don't think that is what he's doing with this text. I think it has more to do with how he sees the individual working and what works best for them.
Yeah, and on these lines, there's a telling part in the discussion where the idea of making a city happy as a whole and making a city happy by maximizing the happiness of its parts are contrasted.
Yes.
Right. And so I think there might be in Plato's mind a difference between making a city that is maximally happy, meaning it functions well as a city, and trying to do it in a way that would start from, let's look at these individuals, let's try to maximize what would benefit them. I think that these things they go together for Plato, but it might not have been the case. Right?
Yeah.
It might have been that you could actually take this particular individual, this guardian, and make them happier by giving them this style of life. But what Socrates says is that would be like painting a face and making the eye so beautiful that it was no longer an eye. We want these things ultimately, and that just comes back again to the centrality of the question, what do we want cities for? And then what do we want justice for? Right? Like we have this word justice, it's important to us. There's got to be something that it's doing. Why do we talk about justice? Is that just so that we don't kill each other? Or is that because justice is something that if we have it, enables us to do better? And that's really, that's the approach. I think one of the things about the important case, which Plato himself invites comparisons to, again, this Weinstein style figure, is that, the way Plato answers that question is really to say, well, that picture of justice is just wrong. Like if it were the case that what we wanted justice for were the kinds of things that Glaucon and Thrasymachus in their pictures of justice say that we want it for, then presumably Weinstein would be gaming the system. He would be getting what we want justice for, which is so that other people don't hurt us and so that we can cooperate. And he would be getting that without being just. And Plato wants to say, well, again, it's like comes back to the health thing, because health and justice turns out to be a kind of health, a psychic health. Your soul is functioning, and civically, justice is a kind of civic health. Your soul, your city is functioning well. It's really like if you could have the benefits of health without health, you wouldn't want that. And once you understand what health is, you would see that that's not the appropriate way to value health. Now, there are things like money where that is the only appropriate way Plato thinks to value them, right? Mm-hmm. If you give to money a role, anything other than an instrumental one in your life, you've made, Plato would say, a fundamental mistake, right? Because money is the kind of thing that only can have instrumental value to help you do other things that are going to make you happy. Justice isn't like that, right? So it's not like you can have a counterfeit justice and get the same thing any more than you can have a counterfeit health.
Right. So you want to talk about forms?
Well, not necessarily, because I see that we've done a bit. I think that I always want to talk about forms. I feel like for me with Plato, the forms are like the light, for a moth. Like I don't ever fully understand what Plato is trying to say, but when I understand glimpses of it, it's always something that attracts me. Okay. I mean, you mentioned when did I first read the Republic, and you said it was had a big influence on my life. Definitely, because it there's a sense of like in the Republic and elsewhere, of course, in texts that you want to study of there being more there that you're kind of seeing, and that if you come back, you're going to understand it better. And the Republic, I think, has never failed to give me more.
Yes. So it is the kind of thing that if you read it multiple times, you'll find more things going on in that text.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that we could spend a long time just talking about the relationships between elements of the Republic that might not at first glance appear related, like, the Cave Allegory and the discussion of the artists, or the Cave Allegory and the appeals to popular culture.
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting that the stuff about the forms was the stuff that we were looking at in that first year English course at York, we read, and I only realized that as I was rereading it this time, we read book 10 in that class. And that would have been it. I think we just read that book because that was the only part that I remembered. And I was still a very young go-getter at that point. I was reading everything that they gave us in class.
Right.
Which
so you were buying and trading stocks while you were reading the Republic
not that kind of young go-getter. It wasn't the 80s. It was the late 90s. But
right. You were
I was happy to read everything they were giving me at that time, which I think all students should be doing.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure we just read book 10. And that's the one about, the couch. And because I remember having those conversations in class about the couch. Is it the couch or the chair?
Yeah. And the cline, and sort of we get the word clinic from. It's like, it's the kind of thing that apparently would be found in a symposium. So It's not a sort of accidental artifact, right? It's not like it could have just as well been a kettle. Like this is something that seems people who have worked on this quite a bit point out that it seems to be quite central to culture, and that the couch is something that is part of the symposium. You're laying on this kind of thing that's there's an ideal form of. And so it's sort of like, what would our cultural activities involve at their best? And, you talked about the religious festival, and I mentioned there being lots of connections between the parts of this work that aren't necessarily immediately apparent. There's a reason why, I think, they start out going to this religious festival, and it's a religious festival that has involved innovation. And they say, hey, they're doing these relay races on torches now. And in fact, it's a religious festival that is, at the time of the Republic, a relatively new import to Athens. And so it's not an accident that at the beginning, these characters have come from this festival, and they kind of ask, is this a good thing? Is this an innovation that we don't want? We've allowed this in. Not coincidentally, it's taking place at the Piraeus, which is the docks. It's where you're likely to find people that are from elsewhere. And so there's a kind of worry, is this an outside import that we want or not? And that, I think, from the very beginning frames this issue of, how do we talk about this appropriately? Like, we might express our own sort of shot in the dark feeling. I don't like it. I don't think torches are appropriate. And we might say, I saw an episode of this or that show where they had torches, didn't work out. Right? We want in the Republic to have an appropriate way to answer that question.
Right.
And
which,
Plato,
by the way, if I could just not to dwell on this again, and we shouldn't go back to something that we've kind of already maybe solved a little bit, but Plato also, another thing that he doesn't like is innovation.
No,
or that he does not want to have in his ideal city is experimentation and innovation.
Well, is that? I mean, it's funny though, because he's a hypocrite in this respect, right? Because like, no one can look at the city that Socrates ends up building with all of its social arrangements. Like, there are no families. I mean, presumably that's going to look like an innovation.
Yeah, I think it's once it's the kind of society I want it to be, there must not be any innovative art after that.
Right, exactly. Although, again, like, one could say that, and I think this is a very big part of why Socrates and Plato wrote about these topics. I think there was a very deep anxiety among members of their class, who are aristocrats, about changes that have occurred in the society. We have the Republic taking place against the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War. We have characters in the first book of the Republic who will be killed or participate in tyrannical regimes that replace the democracy. We have a character who's been murdered, Socrates, by the state for perhaps being too closely associated with these kinds of tyrannies. And there's a certain tradition of people who, in fact, prefer Sparta and sympathize with Sparta in the war effort because they don't like the Athenian democracy. and they would prefer Athens to have a kind of aristocracy or oligarchy that's closer to that in Sparta. So anyway, there's definitely a reactionary tone to what Plato's doing, and so it is right. He doesn't like innovation, but I do think in Plato's defense that he at very least tries to tell us why we don't want this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what I meant about at the beginning. It might have been just, well, I don't like this new goddess, right? But what more can you say?
Right.
Plato thinks that you can say a whole lot more.
Right.
You can say this goddess doesn't do the things that we would want a goddess to do based on the function that religion is supposed to have in our society.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And obviously, if you think as Plato does, and I think he's right in thinking this, I think most people agree with this, whether you're on one side of the argument or the other, that culture does play a role in terms of informing what's going to happen in terms of the society. And
Absolutely,
so if there is innovation in this society, it's going to change, right? If the art is going to be innovative, then the society is going to change. And
I think on that level too, the cave allegory. So I mean, I think you're right that he's afraid of innovation, but then also I think it's also correct to say that he's the biggest innovator, right? Like the first person who got out of the cave and then tries to come back down. Like surely this person is the biggest innovator of them all, right? People are like, what are you talking about? Like leave this wall that I'm chained to. What do you mean outside? Right? This is a person that makes Steve Jobs appear to be not a visionary at all, right? Like this is just another cave dweller. This is a real capital V, Kanye West times thousands, or the image of Kanye West that Kanye has for himself, right? This is a big thinker outside the box, outside the cave.
Now I know, at least I get a glimpse of your own hierarchy of things. So there is at least Kanye West, and below there's Steve Jobs, and I'm not sure.
Well, this is all somewhat facetious. I do like Kanye, but Steve Jobs.
Joey Tribbiani is the lowest. Steve Jobs.
But I mean, yeah. So that's just to say, make a point about innovation. But yeah, I have a picture of Steve Jobs. I look at him before I go to bed.
You keep that. You still do that. That was, I remember back in the day.
I still do.
Wow. Yeah, I'm glad you've kept up with that. That's good. But well, I don't know. Have we done? Do you want to do?
I think that's good. I think that I've not worn out my welcome on the J Hutch program, and I would like to come back. So I think that
I would love to have you back and talk more about philosophy, talk about Russian literature, maybe talk about the Ingmar Bergman Faroe Island movies.
Perhaps, yeah.
So much to talk about. This has been fantastic, and it's been. I don't want to use that term again. It's been. I can't think of another word. It's been ideal in the sense that I've learned not only a lot from just our conversations over the last couple of weeks, but in this conversation too. So that's been great.
And it's been wonderful to hear what you think about this book. I've learned a lot because I've dealt with this work for so long, and it's nice to, have a fresher pair of eyes.
Well, I mean, I always think that, I always say to people, I say this, I think, in one of the earlier episodes of this, that I'm not a great reader. Like, I'm not big on reading just in general. I get very easily distracted. And as you know, I said this before, as we undertook this endeavor about 7 weeks ago or something now.
Yeah.
Was you're gonna get a good glimpse of how slow of a reader that I am as I work my way through, and I kept giving you updates all the way through. I'm on book 4 now. I'm on book 7.
Right.
And I'm not very good. I'm not disciplined or anything like that. But the reason why I like reading so much is because I get to have these kinds of conversations. So
yeah, and I think, but the Republic is a slow jam. Right? Like the Republic is something that you want to read slowly. I think probably with the Republic, like you probably can't read it slowly enough.
Yes.
There was a joke that was made at a Greek reading group that I went to as a graduate student, and talking about another Greek reading group that was even slower. And there were worries at one point that the reading group was going backwards. They were actually going backwards in the text. And these reading groups would standardly only get through like the first 2 pages, and you've got 10 weeks. And so to find out that the reading group is actually going backwards, it started at book 1.
Didn't we read this book already?
And then it went backwards. But I think there's a truth to that, and I think the biggest issue with the Republic, when you're teaching it, and you mentioned having it as part of an English class, is that it can easily feel like just one thing after another. And certainly when you're doing a survey class, and depending on where you do philosophy, a lot of times the history of philosophy can be presented like psychology, meaning there's a bunch of stuff here that people have said, and you want to have an idea of Freud, and you write underneath your idea of Freud, unconscious, id, you write like therapy, analysis. With Plato, there can be that kind of grab bag approach where it's like, okay, Plato forms, and when you're studying Plato, you're going to drill yourself like 3 parts.
What am I going to put on the test?
Right. Whereas with Plato, because he's a philosopher, I think the fundamental appeal of what he does really can't be captured by here's what he thinks. It's more a matter of like, how does he argue for this stuff? Right. And unfortunately, students, I think, if you read the Republic too quickly, or as part of 1 week in a 10-week course, it's like you really can get the impression that Plato is some kind of dogmatist, and that Plato just says these forms have to exist. That's it. I've seen them, before I was born. I know they're there. When really Plato is, I think, probably the biggest critic of the forms in his own work. So anyway, I think it's been good reading it. It's always good reading it again. And for students, it's one of the texts I think that can teach undergraduates one of the most important lessons you can learn, and that's that reading can be rewarding because you can end up getting much more out of something than you thought. Like it's like with Shakespeare, right? When you first read Shakespeare, you have this experience, or I think a lot of people do, of like, wow, this is saying something that I had no idea about in the first month that I encountered it. And I've spent years with this, and I keep getting more, and that's a really valuable experience. I think probably the most valuable experience you can give to people sometimes is like, there is more to what you see in front of you, maybe in many cases, than you think. And so, I don't know, to have that experience, the Republic is one of the best texts for having it. Anyway.
Well, I look forward to reading it again. And maybe after we talk about the other things we said we were going to talk about, maybe if I still have this going on in a few years, you can come back again and talk about the Republic again.
Excellent. Yeah, maybe like the 10th anniversary of this podcast, or the Golden Jubilee podcast in 100 years. We can
listen, science is marching on. You never know. You never know what can happen.
What better use than to allow this podcast to continue indefinitely?
If we have provided that kind of impulse to the scientists, I think we've accomplished something here. Listen, I feel bad that I feel bad that I did not, from at the beginning, mention your work in music. If I hope that the audience has made it to this point, because I'm going to talk about it at this point, which is that Ryan also has a YouTube channel where he performs a lot of music live, and he puts on great shows quite often that I do highly recommend.
Thank you.
And I've always, the first time I heard your music was I don't know, you recorded an album, I remember, or like a demo around 2000.
Yeah, when I was like early 20s, 23.
Yeah. And I remember because I was trying my hand at music at that point as well. And I remember thinking, oh, this guy is very super advanced with this stuff. So I've always respected the work that you do.
Thank you.
And And I do really encourage people. And if I may, I'll put the link to your channel in the
Yeah,
little
good,
description.
good. And I'm putting out a couple of simultaneous podcast endeavors that are musical very soon, so I can plug that.
Yeah.
Stay
What are they?
tuned.
Do you want to explain what they're both related to?
Sure. So the idea is to try to tell a musical story in a way that's different than a musical, and maybe just have a different idea of how narrative and music can work together. So they are podcasts. One of them is about the tragic expedition to the South Pole by Robert Falcon Scott and others. Five people died. They were beaten to the South Pole by Amundsen, a Norwegian, and the British failed and died. That's what one of the podcasts is about. It's about Edwardian values and survival and trauma. It's from the perspective of someone who wrote a really wonderful book on it called The Worst Journey in the World. That's what actually got me interested in this, is that the book is so beautiful. It's such a, magical book, but also with a lot of tragedy. So that's one of them. I tell this story of the polar journey. I did a lot of research. Not everything in there is aimed at accuracy. I'm interested in the thematic things. So that's one of them. And then the other one, which I think they're kind of yin and yang to each other. The other one is about the Black Dahlia murder case in Los Angeles from the late 40s. Anyway, so I'm going to be putting both of them out simultaneously, meaning I'm going to do every couple of weeks one episode of each, because I think, to me, they have interesting parallels and interesting opposition. So anyway, that's that.
Yeah, they sound awesome.
It's just music at the end of the day, but I don't know. The point of the podcast is to get people to understand enough about the narrative so that they understand the songs. That's really that's the point of having the additional material.
Yeah, and as I said to you the other night, I've seen kind of the video work that you did that was part of an earlier project, which was really good.
Yeah, it's still ongoing. It's all Port Hope. It's all rooted in this idea of an explorer. I don't know.
Well, it's really good, and I highly recommend people checking it out. So
thank you, Jesse.
And I look forward to hearing it as it comes out.
It's soon. It's upon us.
Good, that's good. So yeah, I look forward to having you back on again to talk about lots of other things. So this was great. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's quite late for you, so I appreciate it.
No, this was good. It was a nice way to spend a Friday night. So even though, as you just mentioned a while ago, most people would not spend a Friday night reading The Republic, I think this was a good way to do it.
No.
This was great. So thank you so much for coming on. Actually, if you want, I normally don't say this in the live stream, but if you want to stick around just after the end credits roll, we can just have a little chat afterwards if you'd like.
All right.
But otherwise, thank you so much for coming on. Thanks everybody for watching, and
thank you.
And we'll see you in the next one. So take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.